Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular episode is the second of two videos that I've prepared as a background introduction on the philosophical and historical concept of literature for my course in literary theory. As I mentioned in the earlier video, Matthew Arnold represents an important landmark because in his essays and books in the 1860s and 1870s, Arnold argued that the teaching of English could play an important role in sustaining the traditional social order of the nation-state. Arnold recognized that the Christian religion had played such a role traditionally in English society, and that in the changing conditions of industrial capitalism, Christianity no longer exerted such force. Alarmed by the decline in Sunday church attendance and other indicators of religious observance, Arnold sought a remedy. In the study of English literature, the traditional values that bond the society together could be imparted to generations of students and reinforced. It may come as a surprise that this was a departure. In fact, in the traditional university and school curricula, literature in English was not studied. Grammar school students originally studied Latin. University students might study Latin and Greek, but it didn't make sense to teach English literature. The students already could speak English, so what was there to teach? Students could read Shakespeare and like Shakespeare or not, as they chose. But as Arnold's arguments began to take hold, courses in literature began to appear in colleges and universities. Somewhat tellingly, the first such courses on record are found not in England itself, but in India, under the British colonial administration. English literature courses were introduced in India as a way of imparting traditional English values to the Indian students who would be trained to work as clerks in the colonial administration. Another early audience for English literature was female students. As women began to be admitted to English and American universities, the assumption seems to have been that women would not be capable of mastering a difficult subject like Latin or Greek. English literature was the fit subject for women. This pattern held true until the beginning of the 20th century. The typical pedagogical practice in those 19th century English literature courses focused on rote memorization, biographical details about authors and their literary works, and the philological study of literature, the study of literature as a key to the origins of vernacular languages and changes in languages. But along the lines of Matthew Arnold's agenda to promote traditional values and uphold the national culture, it was significant that students were studying English literature, not Greek or Latin. A key adherent in the United States of Matthew Arnold's emphasis on the study of literature as a way to support conservative values and the traditions of the nation-state was Harvard University professor Irving Babbitt. In a series of essays and in a book entitled Democracy and Leadership, Babbitt opposed the philological approach. Babbitt's nationalistic approach became known as the New Humanism. By the 1920s, however, after World War I, a general disenchantment with 19th century jingoistic patriotism began to take hold, and eventually this sensibility found its way into the English literature curriculum. A new theory of literature and a new methodology of teaching took hold, and it was called simply New Criticism. The word criticism is significant because, among other things, New Criticism was a reaction against Babbitt's New Humanism. For the new critics, great works of literature had nothing to do with the authors who wrote them or the historical context in which they were written. The great work of literature, they argued, shines in its excellence on its own terms. The word criticism in this new theory is significant because New Criticism set itself against the nationalistic emphasis of Arnold and of Babbitt. There is a sort of a connection to Arnold's concern about the decline of religion because In the writings of some of the influential figures among the new critics, reading literature itself could be mystified into something like a religious experience. New criticism was a dominant force in American literary studies, at least until the late 1970s, and its influence continues to be felt to the current day. Among the many important proponents of the theory, I'll just mention two of them here. Those are W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley. In a couple of co-authored essays in the late 1940s, Wimsatt and Beardsley first argued that the meaning and value of a work of literature has nothing to do with the intention of its author. The literary text makes meaning and has value, or not, on its own terms, in the relationships among the aesthetic components of the work. In a follow-up essay called The Affective Fallacy, Wimsatt and Beardsley argued that an individual reader has nothing to do with the meaning or value of the work. These were some of the most extreme statements of new critical theory, and in actual practice, the English literature curriculum in universities continued to emphasize the study of particular authors like Geoffrey Chaucer, like William Shakespeare, like John Milton, and American authors like Ernest Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, and William Faulkner. And courses in literature were designed to cover particular historical periods of writing in England or in America. And in actual practice, most teachers paid attention to the ways their students were affected by the literary texts. So in my experience, in the actual teaching of literature in American universities, and in its emphasis upon the critical appreciation of the literary work, rather than the work's interest as a specimen of philological research or as an ensemble of details to be learned for historical and nationalistic interest, the study of literature engaged students as readers and could be quite empowering for individual students. The study of literature offered an open window onto the world, but a downside of the strict new critical emphasis upon the work of literature as an artifact unto itself, as an artifact that created its own meaning and value on its own terms, was that inevitably in many classrooms, literature meant whatever the teacher thought it meant. And by the 1970s, with the growth of student populations, after the Great Society expansion of the universities, students drawn from a wider demographic spectrum of American society, more students from the working class, more African American students, the kinds of responses to aesthetic texts that might have seemed inevitable and obvious, self-evident to teachers and students from a more narrow white middle-class background were now less satisfactory than they had been before. And this demographic shift in the student population coincided with, was supported by, and in some ways probably prompted and enabled what we now look back on as the theory revolution in literary and cultural studies. Challenges to the hegemony of new criticism from new theories, such as structuralism, post-structuralism, psychoanalytic theory, feminism, post-colonialism and anti-racist criticism, gender studies and queer theory, cultural materialism, new historicism, eco-criticism, biopower and biopolitics, and new ones continue to appear year by year. Those trends in literary theory from the 1970s forward will now be the focus of the rest of this course. So I'll conclude. But as always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.